Hey, podcast listeners. I'm your host, Barbara Morgan, and you're listening to Austin Film Festival's On Story podcast. This week on On Story, Clint Bentley will talk to us about his work writing and directing Train Dreams. Train Dreams recounts the life of Robert Granier, an early 20th century blue-collar laborer played by Joel Edgerton. Granier begins the film as an orphaned child arriving in Idaho via the Great Northern Railway. He grows up with little direction or sense of purpose, until he falls in love with Gladys Olding, played by Felicity Jones. The pair get married, build a home together, and have a baby girl, but Granier's work keeps him separated from his family for months on end. Granier works in seasons as a railway construction worker, then a logger, then a carriage driver. In the course of his work, Granier bears witness to senseless eruptions of violence, from murders to tragic workplace accidents. As a result, he feels the looming presence of death coming closer and closer. Granier spends his life searching for meaning in the face of the world that seems to destroy and reconstruct itself all around him at breakneck speed. Bentley and his writing partner, Greg Kwedar, adapted the script from Denis Johnson's 2011 novella of the same name. Clint Bentley made his feature screenwriting debut in 2016 with Transpecos, a thriller set at the U.S.-Mexico border. Bentley co-wrote Transpecos with Greg Kwedar, and the pair have continued to collaborate as writing and producing partners. Bentley made his directorial debut in 2021 with Jockey, a drama following a horse racer in declining health who's preparing for what may be his final championship. Next, Bentley and Kwedar co-wrote Sing Sing, a moving drama based on the real-life Rehabilitation Through the Arts program at Sing Sing Maximum Security Prison. The script for Sing Sing earned Bentley an Academy Award nomination for Best Adapted Screenplay. Bentley and Kwedar recently launched their production company, Ethos, to develop their own individual and joint projects and to continue their work under an equitable financing model which they pioneered on Jockey and further developed on Sing Sing. Bentley sat down with AFF moderator Fabian Harford for a conversation on blending magical realism, family drama, and period filmmaking in Train Dreams. But before we dive into this discussion of this beautiful script, we recommend you follow On Story wherever you get your podcasts. Whether you're writing a tragic ghost story, an action epic, a historical limited series, or a murder mystery, we have the episode for you. Clips of Train Dreams, courtesy of BBP Train Dreams, LLC.
You have a co-writer, Greg.
Yes.
How did you guys get connected? What's your relationship like?
We're always writing for a director, and the director's always in the room. Sometimes that's Greg, sometimes that's me. It depends on the film. And so that helps and kind of changes based on the film that we're writing. But we met now like 15 years ago. Neither of us went to film school, and we didn't know each other in college. And Greg was living here in Austin. I had grown up in Florida, and I was kind of like bumming around, and met one of Greg's friends from college, and we were just chatting, and she was like, oh, you should meet Greg. Like, I think you guys will hit it off. We did. We had a lot of shared interests in like the U.S.-Mexico border, which kind of birthed our first film, Transpecos. And then, yeah, Greg and I just hit it off. We started working together pretty quickly, and our friendship really came out of that. And I ended up marrying the gal who introduced us, so it all worked out.
And you guys have a very interesting structure of how you even do paying people out on set, things like that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was something we did with Jockey and then Sing Sing on a bigger scale. And it was really just a factor of like, we made Transpecos. We kind of tapped out any resource we could possibly get in contact with in terms of getting financing. And then it did okay. Like, it did very well for an indie film, but it didn't like fully pay back our investors. I think typically, if you're trying to make your first film, like, it's hard to think about not doing it for like $1 million, and you're going out there trying to raise like $1 million for it, or sometimes more. And that's what we were doing with Jockey, and just couldn't make it work. And so then it was like, when it became the reality that like, okay, we're going to make this for much less. How can we make it for much less in a way that doesn't diminish it as a project? The thing we didn't want to do is go to all of our friends and all of our filmmaking community and say like, all right, come on, none of us are going to get paid anything, but if it is a success, only Greg and I are going to succeed. Mm-hmm. We wanted to make sure that like everybody, like if we're all like in this together and we're all sacrificing for the film, that we all have the chance to succeed with it. And so then we created this model that everybody gets paid the same rate, The only differential is time. If you work longer on the film, you get paid more. And then everybody shares in the equity of the film. And then with each of them, we figured out ways to split money off the top so that even if the films never went into profit, we would still have money to share with cast and crew.
All your films are almost very different genres in a way. You have, Trans-Pecos is suspense, thriller, and then you have Jockey and Sing Sing, which are relational dramas, and now you've shifted to a period piece. That is unusual as well, I think, for folks in the industry to change genre. How has that been for you?
It was very difficult being in the passenger seat with Greg. Going from Trans-Pecos to Sing Sing was a difficult thing because people were like, no, just do more of that. Because Trans-Pecos was more of a thriller, even though there's a lot more going on with it. It was difficult to make that transition. Now it's getting a bit easier for us just from having done it a couple of times. But I think, I don't want to speak for Greg, but I think he would agree. We just get passionate about something and it is what it is. I never wanted to make a period film, and I'm kind of bored by a lot of period films. And yet this story just grabbed me so much, and I love Denis Johnson I've loved him forever as a writer.
Well, let's talk craft a little bit of just the process of writing, those kinds of things. With you and Greg, what's the process? You start working on this project, what does that look like? Do you go through the book? You use cards? How do you do it?
He's the left hand on the keyboard. I'm the right hand on the keyboard. No, it's we outline a lot to try and get both of us on the same page as to what we're going towards, and so that we can be kind of working in tandem. And so there's a lot of outlining, a lot of talking about it. And with this one, this was I think it was our first adaptation. We had done a script. It never got made, but it was a script about a historical event. Okay. And so we had kind of gotten a dry run in taking a bunch of material and how do you be faithful to this material while also letting the story go where the story needs to go. As everybody in this room knows, when you're writing, the story kind of, if you're lucky, kind of takes on a life of its own. And so it was a lot of just reading the book, probably read the book 5 times, listening to the book on Will Patton, who ends up narrating the film, narrated the audiobook, and does a beautiful job in both. And yeah, just getting underneath it and then outlining it. And then the nice thing, again, going back to it, is we're writing, but we always have the director in the room. Right. So when you hit kind of an impasse where it's well, this could go this way or it could go that way, the filmmaker is there to say, it should go this way. And that's been, I think, really helpful to us as we've written our scripts. And then as any partnership, you hit these things where people see differently on things. Yeah. But yeah, then we take it in chunks and I'll write a chunk, Greg will write a chunk, and then we'll pass those 3 or 4 scenes at a time. And so it's kind of feeling cohesive already, passing those back and forth, and then just editing each other's materials and then putting it in a master document and then reading it and hopefully not feeling too depressed when we read that first draft, but usually do. And then it's just a long process of just doing all the fine tuning along the way. And sometimes you read it and you're like, oh, this thing that seemed very smart in the outline is idiotic idea. I don't know who came, why did we do this?
I read the novella before I saw your film. And as I was reading it, I was thinking, this is not a novella I would read and think, I want to make this into a film. What was it that drew you to the story? Did you see it already visually when you were reading it?
Yeah, it was a thing where I actually it's one of these lovely and rare instances, I think, where the industry gives you something that you wouldn't have expected otherwise. Like I said, I've been a big fan of Denis Johnson for a long time. And this was actually the first piece of his that I had read, and I loved it as a book. And yet I never would have thought about it as a film. And I think if you've read the book, it doesn't immediately look like a movie where you're like, oh, I see a plot and all of that. And there were some producers who had the rights to the book, and they reached out after seeing Jockey and asked me about adapting it. And I read it again with that in mind, and I just fell in love with it. And I think, to your point, there seemed to be so much cinematic potential to it. And just in terms of you can play with dreams and you can play with magical realism, but it's also, there's a relationship drama within it. And there's a family story. There's just all these things. There's a working class story within it. And it seemed like a great bed to have all of these different things that you don't usually get to put all these in a movie. And so there was that. There's questions of our relationship with nature. And it just seemed like also a bed for me to be able to talk about a lot of the things I wanted to ask questions about, our relationship with time and death and nature and all these things.
His name was Robert Granier, and he lived more than 80 years in and around the town of Bonners Ferry, Idaho. In his time, he traveled west to within a few dozen miles of the Pacific, though he'd never seen the ocean itself, and as far east as the town of Libby, 40 miles inside Montana. When he was sent by himself to the town of Fry, Idaho, he was 6, or possibly 7. He never knew for sure the year or day of his birth. How he had lost his original parents, nobody ever told him.
The story of Robert Granier at the center of it was really, that was the grounding thing of just like this simple person who leads a life that isn't something that you'd even write a long obituary for. If like in the newspaper, if he was a real person and had died, his obituary would have been that long. And yet he lived this beautiful, incredible life. And that's something I wanted to dive into.
So after you got that call to consider adapting it, you read it through that lens. What were the things that stood out to you as like exciting and interesting? And what were the things that you were like, ooh, I don't know how that part's going to work out?
All of the like, it's a film about logging and it's a film that's set out in these huge trees in the Pacific Northwest and these beautiful old forests and the magical realism. Like all of these things were like super exciting to think about. And there's just some delicious characters inside of it. There was all of that. The things that were scary were like, what was scary about it was also what was exciting about it. And what was scary about it and exciting was like, it's a person's whole life. You're like going through this person's whole life and the book is only 117 pages long, as you know, and yet you feel like you experienced this entire life. And it has this like breadth to it, even in its brevity, that I wanted to try and do something like that in a film. And I wanted to think about like a film like Jules and Jim or Benjamin Button or something like that, that like shows a whole life and yet doesn't get like get into the boring tropes of like, and then he was 5 and then he went to school, you know, like, it's just like, yeah. I wanted to try and like figure out how to do that in a way where it felt fresh. And that was fun, but also really hard.
When we talk about adaptation, whenever I talk to a writer who's working on adaptation, the question of like faithfulness always comes up. Are you faithful to the source material? What does that mean? It's
a great question and an important one to think about adaptation. I had thought about it a lot just as a film fan of like looking at adaptations that worked really well and looking at adaptations that didn't. And like most of the time it worked really well when the filmmaker freed themselves from the source material. And there's a lot of examples of that happening. And then you look at the ones that are like tried to just like be one-to-one. And there's the very rare instance like with No Country for Old Men where if you read that book, like it's kind of one-to-one. But I think the book was originally a screenplay before he turned it into a novel. And so that's a very rare instance. And there's a lot of like specific questions you always find yourself in that like seem like not a big thing when you're thinking about it. And then you get to that scene and you're like, oh no, what do I do with this? But at the bottom of it, at the base of it, it was just, I wanted to take this approach where I was, and in the writing that Greg and I did, like that we were completely loyal to the spirit of the book and faithful to the spirit of the book and the general story, and then let the rest go if it needed to. And there, you hit some big points where you're like, oh, I can't actually change this, or that ends up, this plot point actually is part of what makes the spirit of the book the spirit of the book. But then the rest is kind of fair game because it needs to be almost an interpretation of the book.
Okay, let's talk structure, spine, that kind of thing, plot. The pacing of the book, for me at least, as I was listening to it, felt like very similar throughout, kind of a set, like a metronome also. The film did not feel that way at all. It felt very much like building up to things, like a very nice story arc, like pacing shifted. Some moments were fast and furious and some moments were slow and soft. Did you always know you wanted to shift that? How did you pick which moments from the book to use to build that tension and suspense?
I think it's one of the things, in adapting of like literature is just a different form. Right. And the novella in this case is like, it's just a different form of art that has its own rhythms that you can sit into as a person taking it in than film does. And cinema just has different rhythms that they're not standard to one or the other. But I didn't think about it in terms of like the rhythm of the book versus the rhythm of the movie. What I did think about was like the book does something beautiful where it's like, it'll be talking about a scene and then all of a sudden in one sentence, it's 10 years later. Or then he's doing something and then all of a sudden he remembers this that happened 20 years ago. And then you're in that scene. It's not just like you're actually there as he's experiencing it. And I wanted to bring that sense to the movie. And that's going back to like, okay, this is kind of like, it's a whole person's life. I wanted to find a way in the edit, really, and it starts in the script, but like really in the edit is where like you either can solve it or not, which is like, how do you have a movie going forward and kind of like time progressing? And sometimes it feels like 5 years have gone by in his life in that 2 minutes that we've just watched. And then sometimes you settle into a scene and it's a real like conversation between a guy and his wife, like when the baby's woken them up and they're just like having this kind of late night conversation. And like, how do you do that without making the film rhythmically feel like it's whiplashing or that it has no idea what it's doing? And so that was the thing that I thought about from the book.
Was she crying?
Not too bad. She just woke up hungry.
Do you know what all the cries mean?
Most of them, I guess.
How much does she know, do you think?
I don't know.
As much as a dog pup?
A dog pup can live on its own after its mama weans it away. Baby couldn't just go off and live after it was weaned.
Do you think that she knows that I'm her daddy?
Of course she does. Deep down, she knows it. Even if she doesn't know she knows it yet. Don't worry. You'll have plenty of time to be her daddy.
Even when you were describing a moment ago, his character in the book kind of having this pace of life, this simplicity to his life, I feel like one of the things you did with the movie that I loved was that you freed him up to be simple in the movie by creating the tension through other elements, through visual elements, through music, through sound, all those kinds of things.
Yes, it was always the intention early on of like, how do you have quote unquote, like what would be seen as a passive character? Right. And I had somebody say this to me at a different screening where they're like, I would have rejected this script had it come in as a development executive because the character's not active. There's no save the cat moment in the beginning. In fact, there's kind of the opposite of that happens fairly early on. And yeah, that was all like in the script, and it was difficult because like, how do you have a character that you feel growth in and a story that's progressing without that character striving for certain things other than striving for, I just want to be at home with the family and I just want to like have my life back how it was before this tragedy struck it. And that's a hard thing to show. And a big part of that was like, okay, let's try and show these upheavals around this person that are happening. But it was very like delicate thing where it can kind of like, it can get mushy very quickly.
Y'all going on to another job or you're quitting for the season?
I can't decide. I'm never happy when the job ends for some reason. Just feel itchy inside.
That's because it's rough work, gentlemen. Not just on the body, but on the soul. We just cut down trees that have been here for 500 years. Upsets a man's soul whether you recognize it or not.
I'll have $200 in my pocket tomorrow morning. Don't bother my soul. Not one damn bit.
That's because you Minnesota fellas don't know nothing about history.
These trees are really that old?
Well, some's older even. This world is intricately stitched together, boys. Every thread we pull, we know not how it affects the design of things. We are but children on this earth, pulling bolts out of a Ferris wheel, thinking ourselves to be gods.
That's horse shit. I've been to Washington, too. Cut all up through Canada and back down again. There's enough logs for us to cut for 1,000 years. And then when the last one's cut, well, first one will be growed up as big as anything around today.
I remember thinking the same thing when I was a young man. Very same thing.
Both Jockey and Sing Sing are, their tone is very relational, and there's these moments, it's hyper-realistic, almost in moments feels like a documentary, you know? You feel like this is very true to life, very real. You shifted from that to like a magical, poetic period piece, but somehow it carries the same feel for me of like very authentic. Like, I know you didn't like go back in time and use real loggers, but there's that same sense about it. I want to know if that's intentional for you guys when you're working on a project. Was this more challenging because it was a historical period piece, magical, those kinds of things?
It wasn't. I don't know. Coming from Jockey, I feel like Jockey was a nice like test case for like how to make something like this. And I feel like there's more similarities into this than not, but I don't know. But like in Jockey, having these moments where, we had these moments where it's just like a bunch of real jockeys sitting around talking about their lives and kind of like almost an AA meeting. But then also we had moments in there where it's like, I read that there was a river where wild horses lived in this area, and we're just going to go there with the actors and see what we can find. And then you have this magical moment at sunset with these wild horses walking out onto a river and your actor interacting with them. And so the hard part in going into Train Dreams was just how do you do that, to your point, like in a period film where it's like, okay, we have to build a cabin and it's there. And we have these like moments of like, you've got everybody in period costumes and you can't just like walk out on the street and like kind of do whatever. And so finding that way to like have those found moments within that was very difficult. But I had a great partner with Adolfo Veloso as a cinematographer, and then all the actors were game to try it. And so we could just like go into a space when it was appropriate and just be like, all right, there's chickens. I don't know, just feed the chickens and we'll see what happens. And magic always kind of came from that.
There are a lot of magical ghost-like moments. When you were thinking of how to translate those, how did you write that out in the script? Did that shift over time? Did you always know you wanted to represent it the way you did in the final product?
There's two in particular, one that won't be giving much away, of like he witnesses and has some hand in a guy getting murdered in the beginning of the film. And then that person haunts him because he doesn't know quite what happened and how it happened and all of that. That person haunts him. Finding a way to do that, it was written one way in the script. I thought back to a movie by Jacques Audiard called Un Prophète, where there's a guy who, I can't remember if he kills him or if he has a hand in killing him, but that guy just shows up in his cell from time to time. But it's as if he's just there. He doesn't have this ghostly aura around him or anything like that. And so I wanted to just like go like that. And Bergman has a couple ghosts in his films where it's kind of similar, where the person's just there and it's like freaky, but also kind of beautiful and sad in a way. Now doing that, actually figuring out like, okay, but when you're on set, like where's this person going to, how close are they going to be? How far are they going to be? Do you give them their own shot, or are they always in the frame with the other? Like all of those things where you're like, oh no, I did not think about this. It was really tough.
What's keeping me awake over there?
Oh, aren't you? Do you think that the bad things that we do follow us through life?
I don't know. I've seen bad men raised up and good men brought to the knees. I reckon if I could figure it out, I'd be sleeping next to someone a lot better looking than you.
We talk a lot, in these panels about visual storytelling, but then often when you're talking to a screenwriter, so much of the focus is on the dialogue, the character, the things that are said. This film to me was such an amazing representation of visual storytelling. Every moment from the very beginning is like a visual feast, and it's not just indulgent in that way, it's really moving the story forward. I would love for you to convey what you can to these folks about how you approach visual storytelling, because I think your ability to do that in this film was kind of amazing.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, there's two things. I think there's something about like the novelistic feel to certain films, I think comes from it just feeling a bit non-traditional, and feeling like it's like, okay, I'm sitting in and we're telling a story now. And this person's telling us a story versus instead of just like, okay, here's the setup and then here's going to be the inciting incident and then there's the second act twist. And like, when it just kind of feels like you can settle into a story, that's, I think, when we feel like as viewers that we're watching something more akin to literature. And there's a lot of great examples of that. Visual storytelling, Greg and I like had a mentor early on tell us, and he's just a screenwriter. He directs also, but he's an amazing screenwriter and like that's his trade. And yet he's like, use dialogue only as a last resort. And I think it's a really good piece of advice. And it's something that like, it doesn't always work because sometimes you just need two people to sit down at a diner and just talk. And then you don't need to have them like, then if they're not talking, they're just moving things around on the table and you think there's so much like meaning in that, like you're lost. But there's something amazing that happens in film and in cinema where you put two things together and the audience makes something else out of it. And sometimes that's just, oh, he's walking with a certain look on his face, and then we're going to cut to this tree falling, and it's just a shot of a tree falling, and yet people will be like, that's a very sad image. And they're thinking about all these other things, and that's the thing you're always trying to get to, is like putting these things together in such a way where then you cut to a shot of a toy on the ground in the cabin that you saw the kid playing with earlier, that it's a very kind of poignant shot. Even though it's just a shot of a toy on the ground, you could see it in any Tide commercial. But somehow in this context, it becomes something different. And I think watching silent films, like you watch what Murnau does, you watch what Charlie Chaplin does, and when you go back to that type of filmmaking where kind of like we formed the language, it's really very inspiring. And like introducing my 5-year-old to Charlie Chaplin and watching him watch them, and then he would say like, oh, he's mad at that guy, or oh, he wants that thing. And there's no dialogue happening telling him that. And he would understand these character relationships between these characters very quickly. And it's a really good lesson to like that thing of like, okay, if somebody was watching your film and the sound went out, would it still work?
How do you, in an adaptation, there's so much that's internal in the book, right? That's narrated or internal. How do you think about externalizing that in terms of dialogue? Is that a process for you guys you talk about?
Yeah, it's especially with a book like this that has very little dialogue in it, and it's very spare in terms of that. It kind of like leaves it open for interpretation. It's again that thing of like, where are you using it? If you're not using it very much, like where are you using it really well? It's also just like finding things in your script and in your film that can balance other things out. And so if you've got a very like taciturn, quiet character in Robert Granier, your lead character, then you can put like a bunch of very like chatty characters around him who are just like rattling off things because it's nice for the audience. And William H. Macy does this beautifully where he's just like rattling on, never working.
He was the oldest man on most jobs, always yammering, staying out of the way of hard work.
You let me at that hatchet. You boys need a break. I get the job and you come to work in the morning, the chips won't get be settled from yesterday. I'm made for this summer organ. I don't get my gears turned smooth till it's over 100. That's good. All this summer, no rain. My day, we worked around the whole clock, and I just went suited. Back then, we'd riddle a bowl with auger holes. Sometimes we had to wait a week for a good wind to topple them behemoths. And then they all came tumbling down at once. Trees twice as big, and then we're cutting around here.
And then also like this one had a narrator, like we put a narrator in it, and that was something from, I think we had talked about doing it a bit more straight ahead without a narrator. And you don't want to like do the thing where it's like the narrator is a cheat. You know, you want to, how can it be, again, like Jules and Jim or like Y Tu Mama Tambien, how can it be one of these films where the narrator is like really adding something potent to the story?
There were once passageways to the old world, strange trails, hidden paths. You turn a corner and suddenly find yourself face to face with the great mystery, the foundation of all things. And even though that old world is gone now, even though it's been rolled up like a scroll and put somewhere, you can still feel the echo of it.
We don't see a lot of stories like this on the screen, I think in part because if you're writing a script when you have a character who's alone a lot of their life, were there characters that you increased, fleshed out more, relationships you built out more so that you could help us get to know this man a little better?
Yeah, Gladys is a big one who Felicity Jones plays in the movie, and they get married. She was always very important in the book, but there's not a lot that she does. And that was a character that was built out hand in hand with Felicity of taking her ideas of like how to build that character out. And that's a much bigger one. There's another character played by Carrie Condon. Again, she's very important in the book, but there's not very much that she does, and she's a different take on the character. That was one where we took the most liberty, and there's one line in particular that she has in the book that's like a very important line and kind of turns a bit of his understanding of himself in the book. And that was the one, that's basically like the thing that was, she kept her name in the movie from the book, and she kept that line. And then everything else that happens leads up to that line. And so that's one that like is very different. But again, I think the spirit is there.
Definitely. When you go through something like that, nothing you do is crazy. You just go through what you go through. In the forest, every least thing's important. It's all threaded together, so you can't tell where one thing ends and another begins if you really look at it. The little insects you can't even see, they play a role as vital as the river. The dead tree is as important as the living one. There must be something for us to learn from that.
What if you got nothing left to give? What then?
The world needs a hermit in the woods as much as a preacher in the pulpit, you know?
Yeah. Is that what I am? A hermit?
I mean, I believe we both are, in our own ways. Just waiting to see what we've been left here for.
What have you learned over the course of your work in your writing about making a character-driven story?
Finding ways for them to not say things. And Sing Sing's a good example of this, and Jockey as well, but Sing Sing, we were better at it, of just like having two characters who there's a lot going on between them, but they're not in a situation where they're able to say it. Hey, I need you to show up for me because this, that, and the other, and I'm wounded in this way, whatever. Or I need you to give me space because this is happening. And so how do you do that? One thing that I'm finding, and I don't know, I feel like it's a funny thing because every time I start a new script, I'm like, I don't feel like I've ever written a script before. They're like, how do you do this? Where do you start? But there is so much in the setup. And I think that there's something, I listened to a podcast many years ago with Paul Schrader, where he said that film and screenwriting comes from the oral tradition, not the written tradition. And I think we think about it more from like that it comes from literature, but it really doesn't. It comes from telling a story that then you're going to represent. And so that, like, thinking back to that, and that's helped a lot in terms of like, okay, I need to be able to articulate who these characters are, what they're going through. And so much of that comes from the setup.
Can you talk a little bit about how you see characters in conflict, how you felt like you could create a transformation for Robert without him having conflict with people?
We think about a lot of our favorite movies, and they do break the rules. And that's that can be very exciting if it's harder to do, but it can be very exciting to do that and like mix something up. And it's always, as an audience, the audience is so much more literate now than even they were 10 years ago. It makes you want to give them something interesting. And I think going back with the conflict thing, a lot of times, we think about conflict of like, this person is trying to kill that person, or this person is trying to rob that person. And that is conflict. But a lot of the conflict that happens in our lives is just like, oh, I'm not communicating well with my partner right now. We're not on the same page, and that's tough, or like, oh, I have to make dinner again. It's another day and I have to figure out what to make for dinner. Like, we all go through that and it's tough. And I think I was just trying to like lean into like, we all have conflict in our lives, or like you've got like a sore in your, like that you're worried about, that like, oh, is that cancer? Like that kind of those underlying things that you're worried about. And I think trying to like put that on film in a way that wasn't like this person's trying to attack that person.
On Story is brought to you in part by the Alice Kleberg Reynolds Foundation, a Texas family providing innovative funding since 1979. On Story is also brought to you by Bogle Family Vineyards, 6th-generation farmers and 3rd-generation winemakers based in Clarksburg, California. Makers of sustainably grown wines that are a reflection of their family values since 1968. The project is supported in part by the Texas Commission on the Arts. This show is produced by myself, Barbara Morgan, Elizabeth Mims, and Emily Locke. Our associate producer is Freya Neely, and our editor is Anna Kolarova. Music is by Brian Ramos. Copywriting by Mazzy Smallwood. Production assistance comes from Dennis Moniger, Travis Kennedy Sound, Phil Mazzetti, and KUT 90.5 in Austin. Go to austinfilmfestival.com to learn more about Austin Film Festival and Conference each October. Until next time, I'm Barbara Morgan, and this has been Austin Film Festival's On Story.